The sticker said $40, and it was pressed crooked onto the rim of my grandmother's dinner plate, half over the little gold ring she used to trace with her thumb when she talked. I stood on my in-laws' driveway on a gray Saturday morning in October, holding a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold, and I could not make my feet move. There, on a wobbly folding table between a box of tangled phone chargers and a lamp with no shade, was the Wren Cottage china. My china. The only thing in the world my grandmother had left to me by name. And a woman I had never met was holding two of the teacups up to the flat autumn light, deciding whether they were worth the price. Let me back up, because you need to understand what those plates were and why the sight of that sticker felt like a hand closing around my throat. My grandmother, Ada, raised me in a narrow house that smelled of bread and lavender and turpentine. She had been a china painter when she was young, in a small workshop near the coast. And even after her hands got stiff, she kept one full service, wrapped in flannel, in the top of her wardrobe. It was white, with a thin band of gold, and scattered across the rims, tiny hand-painted wrens, brown and quick. Each one slightly different because she had painted every single one herself. As a child, I thought the birds moved when I was not looking. I remember watching her paint on the rare afternoons her hands still allowed it. She would sit at the kitchen table with a jar of cloudy water, a scrap of white tile, and a brush so fine it looked like a single eyelash. She painted the wrens without looking at any model, from memory, from something inside her. A small brown flick of the wrist for the body, and then 2 dots and a line for the eye and beak. And a bird would appear where a second before there had been nothing. You have to paint the bird as if it might fly off before you finish, she told me once, so you don't fuss it to death. I did not understand her then. I think I understand her now. She never fussed. She made the small, true mark and let it be. She served me toast on those plates on the morning of my mother's funeral, when I was 9 and did not understand where my mother had gone. She served me tea on them the night before my wedding, her hands shaking. So badly the cup rattled, and she said, "These will be yours, Nora." Not because they are fine, because they remember you. I did not know what she meant then. I know now. Objects can hold a person's attention across years, the way a letter holds ink. When my grandmother died, I was 26, and the china was written into the short, careful will she left in her own slanted hand. To my granddaughter Nora, the Wren service, all of it. Here is where the trouble started, and it started so gently that I did not feel it for what it was. Daniel and I had just married. Our first apartment was small and damp, with a kitchen the size of a closet. And there was truly nowhere safe to keep a full set of antique porcelain. My mother-in-law, Diane, offered to store it. "We have the whole basement," she said, patting my hand. "And honestly, sweetheart, you don't want to be tripping over Grandma's dishes in that shoebox you live in." It was kind. It sounded kind. So we drove 3 flannel-wrapped boxes to the Halstead house on the hill, and I watched them carry my grandmother down the stairs. And I told myself it was only for a little while. That was 6 years ago. 6 years of me saying once or twice a year, maybe we should bring the china home now, and Diane saying, "Oh, there's no rush. It's perfectly safe here." And me letting it go, because I did not want to seem greedy, because I was the daughter-in-law, and I was always trying not to take up too much room. The Halsteads were a loud, confident family, Diane ran every holiday like a general. My father-in-law, Gerald, told the same 3 jokes and laughed hardest at all of them. Daniel's sister, Katie, had opinions about everything, delivered quickly and forgotten just as fast. And I, quiet Nora, who painted watercolors nobody bought and worked part-time at the library, learned to smile and pass the potatoes. I can point to the exact moment I learned my place at that table. It was my first Thanksgiving as a Halstead, and I had spent 2 days making my grandmother's bread, the recipe with the caraway, the one that took 3 risings. I carried it in, still warm, proud of it, and Diane took the basket from me, set it on the counter behind the good rolls she had bought, and it was never brought out. Nobody ate my bread. At the end of the night, I found it, cold and untouched, and I wrapped it back up and carried it home, and I told myself it did not matter. That is the thing about being made small. It happens one uneaten loaf at a time. There's no rush at a time until you have folded yourself so neatly that you fit in a drawer. And you have stopped noticing the shape of the drawer. So on that October Saturday, I had not even known there was a garage sale. I had driven up to drop off a casserole dish Diane had lent me. And instead, I found half the neighborhood picking through folding tables on the driveway. And my grandmother's plates laid out under a hand-lettered sign that said, "Everything must go." My coffee cup crumpled a little in my hand. The woman with the teacups looked at me and said brightly, "Aren't these darling?" "Only 40 for the whole lot. Real hand-painted," the man said. "Real hand-painted," the man said. I opened my mouth and nothing came out. The woman was still waiting for me to agree with her, holding the teacup up between us. And behind her, a little girl in a purple coat was running her finger along the row of saucers, tipping one so it spun. I wanted to shout at the child to stop, to put it down. Those are my grandmother's, but I had no right to shout. Because as far as this driveway was concerned, they were merchandise. $40 for the lot. Real hand-painted. Get them before they're gone. "They're lovely," I finally managed to say to the woman, and my voice sounded like it belonged to someone underwater. She smiled and set the cup back down and drifted toward the lamp with no shade. And I stood there among strangers, pricing my inheritance, and understood that if I did not do something in the next 60 seconds, I was going to lose all of it, forever, to people who would never. I didn't even know they had bought a piece of my grandmother's hands. I finally found Diane by the garage door, making change from a green cash box, wearing her weekend cardigan and a look of pleasant industry. "Nora, you came to help," she said, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. I said, and I heard my own voice come out thin and strange. "Diane, that's my grandmother's china on the table." She did not even pause counting quarters. "Oh, the old dishes? Honey, they've been in the basement forever collecting dust. Half of them are chipped. We're finally clearing things out for the renovation. You never come get them. So. As if the word finished the sentence. As if 6 years of "there's no rush" had quietly become my fault. I walked to the table on legs that did not feel like mine. I counted. There were the salad plates and the dinner plates and a stack of saucers, and 4 teacups and the little bread dishes with the scalloped edges. My eyes went over them again and again, the way your tongue goes to a missing tooth. Something was wrong. Something was gone. The gravy boat. The gravy boat with the wren painted on the lip, the one my grandmother used every Sunday, was not on the table. And the covered tureen was not there either. I turned back to Diane, and my voice, when it came, was almost a whisper. "Where's the rest of it? Where's the gravy boat?" And Diane said, not looking up, "Oh, a man bought a whole box first thing this morning. Very nice man. Antiques, I think. Gave us a good price." I want to tell you that I made a scene. I want to tell you that I swept the plates into my arms and shouted and demanded and made them all understand in that moment what they had done. But that is not what happened, because that is not who I was then. I stood on the driveway, and I felt something inside me go very quiet and very cold. And I said, in a careful, reasonable voice, "I'm taking the rest of these home now, Diane. They're mine." And Diane finally looked up, faintly annoyed, and said, "Well, you'll have to pay the $40 like everyone else. We've already promised the money to the church roof fund. I paid the $40 for my own grandmother's plates." I counted the bills out into that green cash box with steady hands, and I loaded the flannel-wrapped stack into my back seat. And I drove down the hill before I let myself cry. I pulled over at the bottom of the hill by the old feed store because I could not see the road through my own eyes. I sat there with the engine ticking, and I did something I had not done since her funeral. I talked to my grandmother out loud, in the car, like a woman losing her mind. "I'm sorry," I said. "I left you in their basement. I should have brought you home. I should have made room." And then, because grief always turns to something else, "If you give it long enough," I heard her voice in my head, dry and amused the way she got, saying, "Well, Nora, are you going to cry about it in a parked car? Or are you going to turn one over and look?" She had always told me to look underneath things, at the price of the eggs, at the fine print, at people. Turn it over and look. So I reached into the back seat, unwrapped the top plate, and turned it over in the gray light of the car. There was a small brown mark near the foot and some faint numbers, but my eyes were swimming and my head was pounding. And I told myself it was nothing, a bit of old paint, and I wrapped it back up and drove home. I did not understand yet that I had been holding the answer to everything in my 2 hands at the side of the road. That night, I could not eat. Daniel came home from his shift and found me sitting on the kitchen floor with the plates unwrapped around me in a half circle, holding one up to the ceiling light the way my grandmother used to see the thin place in the porcelain where the light came through. "Mom said you were upset about the dishes," he said, carefully, setting down his keys. Upset about the dishes? Even he had caught the language of it, the shrinking of it. I looked up at him and I said, "Daniel, your parents sold the one thing my grandmother left me on a folding table for $40. And they sold part of it to a stranger before I even knew." He sat down on the floor next to me. And to his credit, he did not defend them right away. He picked up a saucer and turned it over, and he went quiet, because there, on the back, in tiny brown paint under the glaze, was a wren, and beside it 2 initials and a small number, a W and an A, and the number 19. That number was the first thread. I had never really looked at the backs of the plates before. Why would you? But now I turned every piece over, one by one, on the kitchen floor at 11 at night. And I found that each one carried the same little painted wren, the same AW, and a different number underneath. The dinner plates ran from 1 to 12. The saucers had their own sequence. It was a system. My grandmother had numbered them. And numbered things, I realized slowly, are things that were meant to be counted, matched, recorded somewhere. I did not sleep that night. I sat with a cold cup of tea and the strange, dawning sense that my grandmother had left me more than dishes. She had left me a set of clues, and I had been walking past them for years. Daniel stayed on the floor with me until nearly 2 in the morning, and something in him changed that night too. He had grown up believing his mother was difficult, but essentially good, the woman who ran everything because everything needed running. Now he sat holding a numbered saucer, and he said, slowly, as if the words tasted strange, "She had 6 years to give these back to you, and instead she put a sticker on them." He was quiet a moment. "Why would she do that?" And I said the truest thing I knew, which was because she never once thought of them as mine. She thought of them as clutter. She thought of me as someone whose things could be cleared out when it was convenient. Saying it out loud made it real, and Daniel heard it. And to his lasting credit, he did not tell me I was being unfair. He just reached over and squeezed my hand around the little wren. The next morning, I went up to the attic of our house, where 2 boxes of my grandmother's papers had sat since her death, unopened, because opening them hurt. I dragged them into the light, and I went through every envelope. Recipes in her handwriting. A photograph of her as a young woman in a canvas apron, standing in front of a low stone building with other women, all of them holding brushes. On the back, in pencil, someone had written Wren Cottage Studio, Spring. And then, near the bottom of the second box, wrapped in a rubber band that snapped to dust when I touched it, a small stack of letters and one thin, cloth-bound ledger. The ledger's cover said, in gold that had mostly rubbed away, Studio Register. My hands were shaking, and this time, it was not from grief. I could not read all of the ledger that day. It was full of names and numbers and small notes in different hands, faded and cramped, but I understood enough. Wren Cottage Studio had been a real workshop, and it had kept a register of the pieces its painters made, and my grandmother, Ada Whitlock, had been one of them. A.W., Ada Whitlock. The wren was not a decoration, it was her signature. And each numbered piece corresponded to a line in a book that still existed. In a box in my attic, in my grandmother's own careful hand. I sat back on my heels among the dust, and I thought about the man who had bought a whole box that morning, the very nice antiques man. And I felt the cold quiet inside me shift into something that had a direction. One letter in that stack stopped me for a long time. It was written to my grandmother by another woman, a fellow painter at the studio, dated many years ago. And it thanked Ada for keeping the register safe when the studio closed, since you were always the careful one. The careful one. Of course she was. She had carried that ledger through decades and 3 house moves and a war's worth of hard years. And she had left it to me not by accident, but on purpose, tucked into the box of things she knew I would eventually be brave enough to open. She had known, somehow, that a day might come when someone would try to tell me her work was worthless. And she had made sure that when that day came, I would be holding the one book in the world that proved otherwise. I pressed the letter flat, and I said, "All right, Grandma, I'm listening now." For a few days, I did nothing but read. I learned that Wren Cottage had closed decades ago, and that its pieces were rare because the studio had been small and had never mass-produced anything. Every plate was hand-painted by a named woman. I learned from a library database I could reach through my job that a handful of collectors specialized in exactly this kind of small studio porcelain, and that provenance, the documented history of who made a piece and who owned it, could turn a $40 plate into something worth a great deal more. I did not care about the money. I want to be honest about that. What I cared about was that my grandmother's name was under the glaze, and my in-laws had sold her name to a stranger for $40 and put the money toward a church roof without asking me a single question. There was another clue in those reading days, small and easy to miss, and it turned out to matter more than I knew. On the inside back cover of the register, my grandmother had glued a folded slip of paper, a kind of key, explaining her own numbering. Dinner plates ran 1 through 12. Serving pieces ran their own short sequence, and the tureen, the grandest piece, was always number 1. Because it was the first thing I ever finished that I was not ashamed of, she had written in the margin. Number 1, the tureen. The very piece that had been in the first box sold that morning, gone before I even arrived on the driveway. I sat with that for a long time. The first thing she was ever proud of, sold before breakfast by a woman who thought it was chipped clutter. I wrote down every number and what it belonged to, and I began, without quite admitting it to myself, to make a list of what I would need to bring home. Then, on a Thursday evening, the phone rang, and everything I thought I understood got bigger. Diane called me, which she almost never did, and her voice had a false brightness, stretched too tight over something else. "Nora, darling, the funniest thing." A man phoned the house asking about the china. A collector. He's very keen. He keeps talking about a Wren Cottage service and provenance, and he wants to know if there are more pieces. Gerald told him he'd have to speak to you. She laughed, a small, nervous laugh. I told him it was just old dishes, but he was quite insistent. I gave him your number. I hope that's all right. It was, in fact, the first genuinely useful thing Diane had ever done for me, and she had done it by accident. The collector's name was Mr. Okafor, and when he called the next morning, his voice was warm and precise and full of a barely contained excitement that I recognized, because I had felt it in the attic. "Mrs. Halstead," he said, "forgive me, but I bought a box of porcelain at an estate sale a few weeks ago, almost by chance. And when I got it home and cleaned it and turned it over, I realized what I was holding. It is a Wren Cottage service, painter's mark AW, Ada Whitlock. I have been collecting this studio for 11 years, and I have never seen a complete numbered service surface intact. Do you, by any chance, know anything about its history?" I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. "Mr. Okafor," I said, "Ada Whitlock was my grandmother, and I have the studio register." There was a silence on the line so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, very quietly, "You have the register." And then, more quietly still, "Then we may be able to reunite it," he explained, patiently, what I had only half understood. A numbered studio piece with its matching register entry is not just an antique. It is a documented object, a small piece of history, with its provenance proved in the maker's own hand. The gravy boat and the tureen he had bought were numbers 19 and 1. If the register listed them, and it did, then everything could be authenticated. And the value, he said, clearing his throat, was not $40. It was, for the documented set together, a number that made me put my hand flat against my chest. But that was not the part that made the room tilt. The part that made the room tilt was this. Mr. Okafor said, "The box I bought had 11 pieces, but the seller mentioned there had been more. 3 boxes, he said. He'd sold 2 others separately that same morning, to different buyers, before I arrived. He seemed eager to move it all quickly, 3 boxes. I had watched them carry 3 boxes down into that basement 6 years ago. On the driveway that Saturday, there had been 1 table of plates and 1 box already gone to Mr. Okafor. Where were the other pieces? Where was the 3rd box? I thanked Mr. Okafor, arranged to speak again, and hung up. And I sat very still, doing arithmetic that made me sick. They had not cleared out 1 dusty box for a church roof. They had sold my grandmother's entire life's work, in pieces, to 3 different strangers. In a single morning, and they had kept the money, and they had told me $40. That night, Daniel called his mother himself, and I sat across the kitchen table and listened to 1 half of it. He was calm, which was almost worse than shouting. "Mom, how many boxes did you sell?" A pause. "No, not the plates on the table. The boxes. The ones that went before Nora got there?" A longer pause, and I could hear the tinny rise and fall of Diane's voice through the phone, explaining, minimizing. And then Daniel closed his eyes and said, "So there were 3. He listened another moment, and then he said, very quietly, "Mom, don't tell me it was clutter." It had her grandmother's signature on the bottom of every single piece, and he hung up before she could answer. And he put the phone face down on the table, and neither of us said anything for a while. Something between him and his mother had cracked that could not be smoothed over with a bought basket of rolls. I did something then that I had never done in 6 years of marriage. I drove up to the Halstead house on a weekday without calling first, and I went down into the basement myself. Diane fluttered behind me, saying, "Nora, what on earth? There's nothing down there." But I ignored her, which felt like stepping off a cliff. And she was right, in a way. There was nothing down there. But there was the outline of nothing. In the dust on the shelf, where my grandmother's flannel bundles had sat for 6 years, I could see 3 clean rectangles, 3 ghost shapes where 3 boxes had been. And on the floor, kicked half under the shelf, a scrap of flannel I recognized, the pale blue with the frayed edge that had wrapped the tureen. I picked it up. Diane, at the top of the stairs, said in a smaller voice, "We were only trying to help. You never came for them." I climbed the stairs, holding that scrap of flannel, and I looked at my mother-in-law. And for the first time in 6 years, I did not smile and pass the potatoes. I said, "How much, Diane? Not 40. How much did the 3 boxes bring in?" Her face did a complicated thing. Defensiveness and calculation, and the beginnings of fear. And she said, "I don't remember exactly. It was all rather rushed," which was the answer of a person who remembered exactly. I said, "There's a collector. He has one of the boxes. He has the pieces authenticated." My grandmother kept a register with every piece numbered, and I have it. So we're going to know, Diane. We're going to know exactly what was sold and for how much, whether you tell me or not. And I watched the color leave her face. And I understood that until that moment, she had genuinely believed they were only old dishes, and that no one would ever be able to prove otherwise. I did not sleep much in the weeks that followed. I worked methodically, the way my grandmother had painted, one careful stroke at a time. Mr. Okafor was a gift I had not expected, not just for the pieces he held, but because he knew this world. He helped me trace the other 2 buyers through the estate sale company that Diane had, it turned out, hired to run the driveway sale.
a detail she had never mentioned because a hired company keeps records. The company had a list: names, phone numbers, amounts paid. One buyer had paid $220 for a box. Another had paid $280. Mr. Okafor had paid $300 for his before he realized what it was. Nearly $800 in a single morning for the thing my grandmother had left to me by name. And Diane had looked me in the eye on that driveway and said 40. The second buyer lived 40 minutes away, in a house that smelled of linseed oil and sawdust. And when I knocked on his door with my grandmother's photograph in my hand, I did not know how the conversation would go. His name was Mr. Delgado, and he was a wide, gentle man in his 70s who had bought the box because the birds reminded me of my late wife's garden. When I showed him the register and the numbered bases and told him whose hands had painted them, his eyes filled, and he went into the kitchen and brought the box out himself, wrapped in a towel, and set it in my arms before I had even finished asking. "A man restores things for a living," he said. "He learns you don't keep what belongs in another person's story." He would only take back the $220 he had paid, not a cent more. And he made me a cup of coffee, and he asked me to tell him about my grandmother, and I did. And it was the first time telling the story did not feel like bleeding. The third buyer was harder and colder. She had bought her box to resell. And by the time I reached her, she had already listed 2 of the dinner plates online and shipped one to a buyer in another state, which broke something in me. A plate with a number under it flying away. In a padded envelope to a person who would never know its name. She was not cruel, just indifferent. She sold me back what she still had at a markup and shrugged. But Mr. Okafor, patient and relentless, tracked the shipped plate down through a dealer he knew and wrote to the new owner and explained. And the owner, a stranger with a kind heart, sent it back for the price of postage, with a note that said simply, "It should be with its family." Piece by piece, over 6 weeks, my grandmother came home to my kitchen table. Not all of her. A few pieces were gone for good, scattered too far to find. But the wrens gathered back, one and then another, and every night I turned them over and matched the number under the glaze to the line in the register, ticking each one off in pencil, and it felt like calling names at a reunion. Those weeks were strange to live through. On the outside, my life looked ordinary. I went to the library and shelved returns and helped a boy find a book about sharks. I made dinner. I smiled at the neighbor. But underneath, everything had a second layer now, because I was carrying a secret arithmetic in my chest, a slow and careful reckoning. And every plate that came home changed the weight of it. Some nights the anger came up so fast it frightened me, and I would stand at the sink with my hands in hot water until it passed. Other nights it was only sorrow, plain and clean, for my grandmother, who had trusted the wrong people to keep the right thing. I learned in those weeks that quiet is not the same as weak. Quiet can be a woman gathering every piece of the truth before she sets it down where it cannot be argued with. While I worked, I said nothing to the wider family. I did not shout. I did not send furious messages. I did not tell Daniel's sister Katie, who would have told everyone. I simply gathered the register, the letters, the photograph of my grandmother in her canvas apron in front of the studio, the estate company's record of the sale, with the buyers and the amounts, Mr. Okafor's written appraisal on his letterhead describing the Wren Cottage service as a documented and rare survival, and the pieces themselves wrapped again in fresh flannel, matched to their numbers. I laid it all out on my table one night, and Daniel stood in the doorway looking at it, and he said in a low voice, "They lied to you, to your face, about all of it." And I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The anniversary dinner is in 2 weeks." And I said, "I know." Because here is the thing about the Halsteads. Every year, they held a great anniversary dinner, Gerald and Diane's, at the house. On the hill, the whole family and half the neighbors. Diane in her element at the head of a long table, telling everyone how she had built this family with her own 2 hands. It was the most public stage the family had, and I realized, laying out my proof by lamplight, that I did not have to shout at anyone. I did not have to ruin anyone. I only had to let the truth stand in the room where they gathered to admire themselves and let it be seen. I called Mr. Okafor, and I asked him gently whether he would be willing to come to a family dinner and bring the appraisal and one authenticated piece, the gravy boat with the wren on its lip. He said, "Mrs. Halstead, I would be honored, and I think your grandmother would like to be in the room." I barely slept the night before the dinner. I laid my clothes out like armor, packed the register and the letters and the appraisal into a canvas bag, and rehearsed nothing, because I had decided I would not perform. On the drive up the hill the next evening, Daniel reached over and put his hand on mine and said, "You don't have to do this. We could just quietly ask for the money and never come back." And I said, "No, she did it in front of everyone. She made me small in front of everyone for 6 years. The truth gets to stand in the same room." He nodded and did not argue, and we drove the rest of the way in a silence that was, for once, on my side. My grandmother used to say that courage is mostly just deciding once and then not undeciding it every 5 minutes. I had decided. I watched the lit windows of the house on the hill come closer, and I did not undecide. The dinner was on a cold, clear Saturday in December, the windows fogged with heat, and the table so long it nearly touched both walls. Diane was radiant at the head of it, a queen among her platters. She had, I noticed, set the table with a plain new white service from a department store, cheerful and forgettable. Nobody but me knew what should have been there. I helped carry dishes, I smiled, I passed the potatoes. And when the plates were cleared and Gerald was winding up to tell the second of his 3 jokes, the doorbell rang, and I said quietly, "I'll get it." And I let Mr. Okafor in. He was a tall, courteous man in a good coat, carrying a flat wooden case. And the whole table turned to look as I walked him to the space beside my chair. "Everyone," I said, and my voice did not shake, which surprised me. "This is Mr. Okafor. He collects a particular kind of porcelain made by a small studio called Wren Cottage. He drove a long way tonight, and I asked him to come because he has something to show you." Diane's smile stayed fixed, but her eyes went to me, then to the wooden case, then back, and I watched her begin to understand. Mr. Okafor set the case on the sideboard, unlatched it, and lifted out, wrapped in white cloth, my grandmother's gravy boat, and set it in the middle of that long, fogged, over-decorated table where everyone could see the small brown wren on its lip. "This piece," Mr. Okafor said, in his warm, precise voice, "was hand-painted about 60 years ago by a woman named Ada Whitlock at the Wren Cottage studio. I know that, not because I am guessing, but because she signed it." He turned the gravy boat over, gently, and held it so the light fell on the base. And there it was, the wren, the AW, and the number 19. "And I know it is genuine," he went on, "because the studio kept a register of every numbered piece, and that register still exists. It is here tonight. It belonged to Ada Whitlock, and it passed, by her written will, to her granddaughter." He looked at me. The whole table looked at me. And Diane's fixed smile, finally, slowly, came apart. I placed the ledger on the table, opened to the page, and beside it, the photograph of my grandmother, young and laughing in her canvas apron. And beside that, the estate company's printed record of the driveway sale. I did not raise my voice. I said, "This service was left to me. Every piece is numbered in this book, in my grandmother's own hand. 6 years ago, it was stored in this house for safekeeping. In October, it was sold in 3 boxes to 3 different buyers in one morning." I laid my finger on the estate company's list. $220, $280, $300, nearly $800. I looked up at Diane. "You told me 40. You made me pay you $40 for the plates that were already mine." The silence at that table was a physical thing. Katie's fork was halfway to her mouth. Gerald had stopped, mid-joke, and was staring at his wife with a slow, sick dawning. A neighbor coughed. And Diane, cornered at last in the one place she had always felt safe, did what cornered people do. "We were only trying to help," she said, but it came out cracked and small, the words she had used in the basement. And this time, there was no one to nod along. "You never came for them. They were just sitting there." Mr. Okafor, God bless him, said nothing, which was louder than anything. He simply let the gravy boat sit in the middle of the table, with its wren facing the ceiling, and let everyone at that dinner do the arithmetic that I had done alone in my kitchen at midnight. It was Gerald who broke first, which I had not expected. He put down his napkin, and he said to Diane, not to me, in a voice I had never heard from him, "You told me the church fund got $40 from some old dishes." He looked down the table at me. "Nora, I did not know. I want you to know I did not know." And Diane, hearing her own husband step away from her in front of the whole family, finally stopped performing. She did not apologize. Not really. Not that night. But her face, which had ruled that table for as long as I had known it, simply folded. And she stared at the gravy boat with its numbered base as though it were an accusation that could not be argued with, because it was. There is no arguing with a name under the glaze. I did not scream. I did not tell her she was a thief, though she was. I did not demand she be thrown out of her own dinner. That is not what my grandmother would have wanted, and it is not the person I decided that autumn that I was going to be. Instead, I gathered my ledger and my photograph and my papers, and I said simply, "I've bought back most of the pieces from the people you sold them to. It cost me a great deal more than $800, and a lot of nights I'd rather have spent sleeping. The rest of the money that came from selling my grandmother's work, I think should be returned to me. And I think you know that." And then I said the thing that ended it. "I'm not going to make you pay it back tonight. I'm just going to let everyone at this table remember that you could have asked me. One phone call. And you chose not to." Mr. Okafor stayed for coffee. And by the end of the evening, half the table had drifted over to look at the gravy boat and hear him talk about the studio. About the women in canvas aprons who had painted birds onto porcelain 60 years ago. About my grandmother. Katie found me in the hallway near the end of the night by the coats, and for a moment I thought she had come to defend her mother. Because that was the family pattern. Close ranks, smooth it over. But she stood there twisting her ring, and she said, "I bought the good rolls that first Thanksgiving. The ones Mom put out instead of your bread." I stared at her. "I didn't know she was going to hide yours." I've thought about it for years and never said anything. It was such a small confession, a loaf of bread from 6 years ago. And yet, it undid me a little, because it meant someone had noticed. Someone had carried it too. Katie, who had never once asked me a real question in 6 years, then asked me what my grandmother had been like. And I told her, and she listened. Really listened. And I realized the wall I thought was the whole family had only ever been one loud woman at the head of a table, and behind her, people who had simply never been given permission to see me. The dinner that had been built to celebrate Diane ended up, quietly, belonging to Ada Whitlock, whose small brown wren sat in the center of the table, catching the light. Diane spent most of it in the kitchen. Nobody followed her in. In the weeks after, things changed in ways I could not have engineered if I had tried. Diane returned the money, in an envelope, without a note, handed to Daniel rather than to me, because she could not manage to look at me yet. Gerald called me himself and asked, awkwardly, if he could come and see the china properly one afternoon. And he came. And he held each plate carefully in his big hands and turned it over to find the wren. And when he left, he squeezed my shoulder and did not say the 3 jokes. The family did not fall apart. That is the part people always expect. The explosion, the burnt bridges. But the truth, when you let it simply stand in the room, does not need an explosion. It rearranges things quietly. It moves people to their correct places. Diane never ran a holiday the same way again, because everyone at that table now knew what she was capable of, and she knew that they knew. I kept most of the recovered service in a proper glass cabinet, wrapped when not in use, matched to its register. All of it documented now, the way my grandmother had documented it long before I understood what she was doing. Mr. Okafor and I became friends of a sort. He sold his box back to me at cost, and made me promise that if the day ever came that I could not keep the service safe, I would call him first, because a documented, reunited studio set, he said, is a rare and precious thing, and he could not bear for it to scatter again. I promised, but that day is a long way off. My grandmother did not paint those birds to be sold on a folding table, and she did not number them so that they could be lost. She numbered them so they could always find their way back to each other, and to me. The first Sunday after the last piece came home, I did something I had been afraid to do. I set my own table with the wren service, the whole of what I had recovered, and I made my grandmother's bread with the caraway, the one that takes 3 risings. And Daniel and I ate a plain roast dinner off 60-year-old porcelain, painted by a woman who had died, believing at least her dishes were safe. I turned my plate over before I ate, out of habit now, and there she was, the wren, the anwa, the little number. Daniel watched me do it, and turned his over too, and neither of us said anything, because some meals are a kind of prayer. The bread was good. Everyone at that table ate it. There was only one other person there, but everyone ate it. There is one plate I do not keep in the cabinet. It hangs on the wall of my kitchen, where I see it every single morning. Dinner plate number 4. The first one I turned over on the floor that October night, when Daniel... And I found the wren and the number, and understood, together what we were looking at. I turned it face to the wall so that what shows is the back. The small brown bird and the letters AW and the little painted number. My grandmother's signature, her plain and permanent way of saying, I was here and I made this, and it is real. Every morning I drink my coffee under it, and every morning it is still real. And no folding table, and no $40 sticker, and no very nice antiques man, and no fixed and radiant smile at the head of a long table can ever make it not real again. So here is what I want to leave you with, whoever you are, wherever you are listening from tonight. The people who loved us first often leave us things that look small: a set of dishes, a stack of letters, a photograph of a young woman in a canvas apron, laughing. And the world will tell you those things are old, chipped, in the way, not worth the space they take up. But turn them over. Look underneath. Because the people who loved us knew something the world forgets, which is that value is not the same as price, and that a name signed quietly under the glaze, in a hand that once held yours, is worth more than anything a stranger could ever pay for it on a gray Saturday morning. Turn the plate over, find the wren, and then keep it, whatever it costs you, because that is how we carry the ones who carried us.